Hello, and welcome to this first session of the Christian Foundations of Our Deepest Values. In this first class, I will give a general overview of where we're going. We will meet some key players in this discussion, and we will talk about some resources that will help us to chart our path. Today I want to start with some questions that drive my philosophy and ethics students a bit crazy. What are value questions? Value questions are questions that are so obvious on the one hand that the answers seem like they should be very apparent. But then when you try to answer them, they're often frustrating because we really can't get to a good answer. And the reason why is because values are so deep that we often take them for granted and don't think about them at all. Another reason why it's frustrating to answer questions of value is because our answers are really things that we take on faith. We believe, pure and simple. We take it for faith. We take it for granted. We might think we have good reasons, and we might have good reasons, but we haven't thought through those reasons or really thought about why in a deep sense historically or philosophically. Where do human rights come from, Turtle? Can you tell me? Today, I often hear people talking about how important it is to be on the right side of history. What exactly does it mean to be on the right side of history? One way we can approach this question is by taking a look at the signs that many of my neighbors in Berkeley have in their front yards. Here are a couple examples of the types of signs that I often see when I drive around Berkeley or walk around Berkeley. And you can see here that in this house, we believe, and then you have a number of things. In our America, this is true, and you have a number of things. Both of them stress what matters. Both of them stress things like equality. So this idea that all people are equal is an important idea. And we could say, okay, well, why exactly is it the case that all people are equal? How are they equal? If I were to knock on the door of this person's house and say, hey, I would like some food, please, can you treat me equal to, as equal as anyone that's a member of your household? I wonder what they would say. Maybe I could ask them for a kiss, and if they don't kiss me, I can ask them, well, what do they mean by love is love? What does that mean? Why is equality good? Why do humans have rights? Where do rights come from? If women have rights, if men have rights, what are human rights? Where do these rights come from? Are they deeper than something like the Constitution of the United States of America or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Where do these come from? Why is love so important? Love is often a key focus of these signs, and love is something that is emphasized. Love over hate. What about dignity? There's a lot of discussion of human dignity, that even those outside of our social circle, outside of citizenship, have dignity. But why do all humans have dignity? What about science? The statement that science is real. As a philosopher of science, I find this a very interesting statement. And we can ask, well, why is it real? Why is it just not a useful way of measuring things? All right. Why is science reflective of reality? And why should we take it seriously as opposed to just being a useful way to measure things that is good for its utility, but doesn't reflect anything about reality? Scientists tend to be realists, but where does that value come from? Why should we care for someone who is trampled over by society? Why should we care for or protect the vulnerable? Why should we care for victims? Why do Black lives matter? That is the question, right? Why do any lives matter whatsoever, right? Why do women's lives matter? Why do men's lives matter? Why do children's lives matter? Why should we celebrate diversity? Why is freedom of things like freedom of conscience, right? The lower sign believes in religious freedom. And why should someone be free to worship as their conscience dictates? These, again, are the sorts of questions that are difficult. When you really push down and try to find answers to these questions, they're very evasive. People might refer to the Constitution. People might refer to other sorts of documents. And people might think they're just obvious, that we can take them for granted. But they are not. They are not the same values. You will not find these values historically to be the same or in other cultures to be the same. Here is a different sort of sign that I haven't seen in any yards in Berkeley, but it is seen as a sort of counter type of sign that I found interesting. And in this particular house, this is a sign for the front yard. In this house, we believe people are individuals, not categories. Why are individuals important? Right? Violence is not the answer. Well, why not? Where does that value come from? Why is freedom of thought and speech so important? Right? Freedom is clearly important on this sign. Why should science not be political? Why should it be free of ideology? What is the root of a value like this? Why is censorship wrong? Why should we submit to and trust the authorities that govern us? And we can think about the individual too. Why do individuals matter? Why is it not, why does the individual person count as opposed to, what group they belong to? These are other values, and these values also are part of our current context. If you try to push where these values come from, again, you will find yourself striving back through history, and that's exactly the sort of question we're trying to answer in this class. Where do these values come from? But these signs are a good window into the values of households on both the left and the right. See, here's another sign that is arguing for political action, for moral progress through political action. And this one mentions consent, control over our own bodies. And we can ask, well, where does consent come from? This idea of consent regarding your own body and the self-control of your body. Why does that matter? Why do we believe there should be such a thing as moral progress? Why vote? Why try to change society? You can think about where that value comes from. And the one thing that everyone seems to agree upon is that Hitler and the Nazis were bad dudes. And so we can say, well, why exactly were they bad? That is also reflective. What we can agree upon is reflective of the values that we share. So here we have a bunch of values and a window into the households of both the left and the right. And we can think about these values. So I'm here today with some special guests to ask them about where do our values come from.
What's up, guys?
Hello.
What's up, YouTube?
So
back to my
the
channel.
first question is why do you think you have rights? Where do you think rights come from?
From God.
Human rights?
I think rights.
Okay, okay.
Ethics.
Yeah.
Ethics?
Ethics.
Okay.
The way people
Rights are a human construct.
Our human construct? Okay. Other thoughts? We got God, ethics, construct?
I don't believe that religion
Rights
should
influence.
I don't think.
No, I don't think religion should influence it because they didn't come
That wasn't the
until
question.
later
What was the
on.
question?
Where do they come from?
Where do
Yeah.
rights come from?
Where do rights
Rights,
come
I feel
from?
like the ethics between people
I think like
with
maybe
religion, without religion are different.
or
things.
society just make like rules.
But I feel like
things
it's
to
all
work
the same
out,
thing.
and
I
that's
feel
how
like
like
religion just to
ethics show up, I guess.
Okay.
Just all talk.
Okay. Okay.
Lie, but
Okay. Good. Good. Next question.
I couldn't answer that one. So.
Why do you think consent is important?
Well, that's.
Duh. Why the fuck not? I'm sorry. But
You need
like,
to be able. You need to communicate with the person that you're being intimate with. You have to ensure that they're comfortable with what you're doing.
if you're not okay with something, that goes back to human rights. If you're not okay with something, you should be able to say it, and that's what human rights is all about. So
Okay.
I
Okay.
feel like consent is a human right.
Okay. Consent is a human right.
Back in the day, women weren't considered as humans, so like they would do anything to women.
Okay.
So that's why we have these rights.
Okay.
We block these.
Good. Back in the day,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Before what is it called?
I wouldn't say
Women's
a
rights movement.
No, what's
I don't know.
suffrage? Women's suffrage.
Okay.
Wasn't that like
Okay.
20s?
All right.
1920s.
1920s.
All right. Dignity, consent, human rights, equality, that we should care for the weak, that racism is bad. All of these values have a deep history, a deep context, and none of them comes for free. So walk with me while we explore the deep history and foundations of these values and many others. The issue of racism is ubiquitous today. It's everywhere in the news, it's the focus of protests, and we're even having our own conversations about this topic at Berkeley Covenant Church. But have you ever stopped to wonder why exactly is racism so wrong? I'm here with another special guest to talk about the question of why is racism bad? Welcome. So tell me, why is racism bad?
It's bad because it discriminates against race. It literally discriminates against people just for their race, and your race does not say anything towards your character. So it's literally just going off people's looks, and it's bad
Thank you.
and toxic.
Thank you. Like I said before, this is the sort of question that drives my philosophy and ethics students a bit bonkers. And the answers they give are things like, well, it just is. Why even ask that question? You just feel it in your bones. We don't need a reason. They might say that they find it hurtful, or they find it hateful, or that they find it disgusting. When I was a kid, I found ketchup disgusting. Today, I have many friends who find tomatoes disgusting. And we can say, well, does that mean they're morally wrong? Or is it just a matter of taste? Can we say the same with something like racism? Is the wrongness of racism simply a matter of taste, or is there something deeper? Perhaps we should start with a different question. So I sometimes ask my students, why isn't it wrong for two people of the same sex, to be married or to enter into a civil union? And the sort of responses I typically get for that question are based on rights. Well, everyone should have a right to marry who they want. So then I might ask a question like, well, should a 35-year-old woman have a right to marry a 15-year-old boy if there is love shared in that relationship? And then the sort of response I get from that is something based around consent. And my students will often tell me that unless there is consent, then a relationship is not legitimate. But a 15-year-old does not have the capacity for consent. I will typically ask them if they've ever dated at 15 and whether that was a forced relationship. Those who have don't think it is. But we can talk about the question of consent. Where does that idea come from? Where does the idea of rights come from? Where do all these ideas come from that we take totally for granted, like the air we breathe? Where do these ideas come from? To help us to begin to think about some of these questions, I would like to start with and introduce a historian who's focused on these questions for quite a while in a recent book named Tom Holland. Tom Holland's recent book Dominion traces the origin of many of these values, many of these ways that we see some things as right and some things as wrong. He finds that discovering the origin of these values was like coming home. Indeed, it was like coming home from an alien world. Here's a clip where Tom Holland discusses the path that led up to his writing of his recent book, Dominion.
Well, I think that Christianity is also a very important part of In the Shadow of the Sword, because part of the thesis is that of that book is that Islam emerges from a kind of confluence of Jewish and Christian and indeed Roman and Persian and Zoroastrian influences. And certainly I wanted to do something similar for this, but the truth is that it was not initially Christian identity that was my focus. When I wrote In the Shadow of the Sword, I had a lot of Muslim critics who didn't like the way that I was looking at the kind of the origin myths of Islam and trying to put them under the microscope. And they said, how would you feel about this if the same thing happened to your beliefs? And to be honest, my beliefs were a kind of liberal, secular agnosticism. And so I thought that was a fair point, and it was something that I'd been pondering for quite a while, chiefly because of the books that I'd written before In the Shadow of the Sword, which included books on ancient Rome and on ancient Greece. And the experience of writing them, and the Greeks and the Romans had always been my first love. I'd always sided with Pontius Pilate over Jesus. I'd always preferred Athena to the Christian god. And so I'd always vaguely assumed that I was in some sense a Greek or a Roman. But I found the experience of writing about those worlds very, very alienating. I found increasingly, I found them frightening. I realised that I had nothing in common with them at all. And so the question of where my beliefs, my assumptions, my prejudices, the things I took for granted came from, was something that has been shadowing me for as long as I've been writing history. And the process of writing Shadow of the Sword certainly sharpened that. And so when Muslims said, well, where do your beliefs come from? I thought, well, that's a really good question. And so a bit like Theseus tracing his way back through the labyrinth, following the thread. That's what I wanted to do. And I realised that essentially everything that I think and take for granted comes from Christianity. Having said that, I mean, Christianity, I think, mediates a lot of other influences from antiquity. Obviously, Jewish inheritance, Greek, Persian, Roman. But I think by and large, the way that I have inherited the classical past and the Persian influences and the Jewish influences is through the medium of Christianity. And I think that is true not just of me, but of pretty much everyone I know and pretty much the whole of the society in which we live. And so that's why I wanted to write it, was I wanted to do, I suppose, to Islam, to do to my own beliefs what I had done to Islam.
Yes, and your own beliefs turned out to be a lot more Christian than you had thought.
Yes, absolutely.
And you feel that others should go on that same journey in terms of...
Well, it depends what your starting assumptions are.
Yeah.
I mean, to the Romans, the idea that men shouldn't be dominant over women, that Romans shouldn't rule and barbarians be subordinate would have seemed grotesque. We are the heirs of very different moral assumptions. But by and large, the things that we tend to take for granted, that we just assume are right because it seems self-evident that they're right, is because we are the heirs of 2,000 years of Christian teachings on this. And this was kind of famously, notoriously pointed out by Nietzsche, who detested Christianity because he unlike most atheists today, who tend to identify themselves with progressive causes, Nietzsche detested Christianity because of its moral teachings. He thought that Christianity had kind of gelded and impaired the blonde beast, that the power and the beauty and the strength and the potency of the strong had been neutered by Christianity, that by elevating the weak, by kind of putting the slave above the master, society had been ruined and destroyed. And that was a perspective that enabled Nietzsche to see that socialists, communists, humanists, progressives, all of them, basically, even though they may say that they were reacting against Christianity, in their fundamentals were deeply Christian.
And tell us where your interest in the whole classical age really began. You've sort of been doing this all of your adult working life, haven't you?
Well, it goes right the way back to childhood, and I was the kind of child who loved dinosaurs. I liked them because they were big and they were fierce and they were glamorous and they were extinct. And my interest I suppose, in the Roman army and then by extension the Roman
is of
Empire.
A similar nature.
Well,
yes.
it was a seamless movement from Tyrannosaurus Rex to Caesar. And so the kind of the glamour and the beauty and the power and the cruelty of the Greeks and the Romans I found very appealing. Yeah. And in contrast to that, although I went to Sunday school and I was very, very interested in biblical history as well, I found them all a bit po-faced, kind of. I didn't like their beards. I preferred kind of the clean-shaven look of Apollo, and so in a way I was kind of seduced by the glamour of Greece and Rome, I suppose. And so the first books I wrote about of history were about Greece and Rome, and in many ways, the appeal particularly I think of Rome is that in certain ways they do seem very like us. So you were talking about Cicero's letters, and this is a man who is worrying about property prices. He's worrying about the weather. He's bitching about
Sounds
people.
Very British, doesn't he?
Yes. So in all kinds of ways, he seems very familiar.
Yes.
But the more you live in the minds of the Romans, and I think even more the Greeks, the more alien they come to seem, the more frightening they come to seem. And what becomes most frightening, really, is a kind of quality of callousness that I think is terrifying because it is completely taken for granted. There's a kind of innocent quality about it. Nobody really questions it.
And what sort of form did that take?
Well, if we're in the age of Cicero, Cicero's great contemporary Caesar is, by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's kind of promoting it. And so when he holds his triumph, people are going through the streets of Rome carrying billboards, boasting about how many people he's killed. And this is a really terrifyingly alien world. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that it is built on systematic exploitation. So the entire economy is founded on slave labor.
Right.
The sexual economy is founded on the absolute right of free Roman males to have sex with anyone that they want, any way that they like. And in almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And so this worried me more and more, and it was kind of like I was thinking, well, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And so where am I coming from? And it was like a kind of itch, you get on your back and you can't find it. And this was then enhanced for me by then writing a book about late antiquity and the emergence of Islam from the late religious the religious and imperial context of late antiquity, and again finding in Islam a profound quality of the alien. That there were aspects of Islam that were very familiar, but there were many aspects of it that again seemed deeply alien. And I began to realize that actually in almost every way I am Christian. And I began to realize that actually Paul, although in many ways he seems a much less familiar figure than Cicero, the kind of urbane man with his property problems, Paul never had any property, he just made tents. Yes. That in almost every what is it, seven, that is the 7 letters that are people conventionally people absolutely accept that, and as Tom Wright was saying, this is not a very lengthy amount of writing, but compacted into this very, very small amount of writing was almost everything that explains the modern world.
Well, the Western world, as we take for granted.
But also the way that the West has then moved on to shape concepts like international law, for instance. So the fact, concepts of human rights, all these kind of things, ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul.
Some of the humanists
Paul really
and atheists,
his letters. His letters, I think, are, along with the 4 Gospels, the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world.
When you penned that article, I think it was for the New Statesman, where you said what I got wrong, and you sort of came out, as it were, and said, as far as my values and background are concerned, I am a Christian. It was interesting to see the response to that, because I saw lots of atheists and humanists saying, oh, hang on, democracy, that goes back to the Greeks, don't pretend that Christianity gave us everything we're grateful for. But you honestly think that actually people simply haven't appreciated just how much we owe to Judeo-Christian?
I think if we're talking of Paul, I think of him as a kind of depth charge deep beneath the foundations of the classical world. And it's not anything that you particularly notice if you're, in Corinth or Alexandria. And then you start feeling this kind of rippling outwards. And, by the time you get to the 11th century in Latin Christendom, everything has changed. And you have this, I think essentially what Paul's significance is that he sets up ripple effects of revolution throughout Western history. So the 11th century, where with the Papal Revolution, essentially it establishes this idea that society has to be reborn, reconfigured, that vested interests have to be torn down. And then the Reformation, what we call the Reformation, is a further ripple effect of that, and the Enlightenment is a further ripple effect of that. And it spilled out so much that now in the 21st century we don't even realize where these ripple effects are coming from. We just take them for granted.
I can hear you.
I'm here with another special guest to talk about where our values come from. And this special guest has just finished reading Tom Holland's book, Dominion. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, having just finished reading Tom Holland's book, Dominion, where do rights and values and things like caring for the weak, where does that come from? Where do those things come from?
Oh, well, reading Tom Holland's book, that definitely comes from Jesus and how he acted, and then Paul and how he interpreted God's words. I mean, that also came from the Jewish tradition, but it was emphasized by Jesus that no one ever expected a Messiah in the Jewish tradition to be a victim like Christ, someone who was supposedly shamefully put to death by the Romans, somehow became the conqueror. So that which the Romans thought of as the worst thing that could possibly happen to a human, the most shameful thing, Jesus turned that around into a conquering thing. And there's no other religion that has anything remotely like that.
Thank you. Christianity has created our conscience. Over thousands of years, it has formed that little voice in the back of our heads that asks us, is our violence justified? Are we being generous enough? Are we taking care of our neighbor? Are we giving justice to the oppressed? Reflecting on the formation of our conscience, historian Tom Holland says this.
What is, I think, suggestive about this is that individual Christians, and indeed even those who may be executioners or kings or military leaders, at the back of their mind there is always the voice of conscience saying, are you sure that this is justified? In a way that no Roman ever had that voice in the back of his head. And I think that is pretty radically different. It means that when a nobleman may be riding out on his horse and he passes a beggar, he'd look down at that beggar, and part of what he is the anxiety that that beggar may be Christ. And it's part of the churn of ideas that makes European history so restless and so transformative.
So if we return to the question we asked earlier, and wonder why exactly is Hitler so evil? Why does everyone agree on that value? If we search for an answer, it seems that the answer, historically, is a particularly Christian answer. Again, historian Tom Holland says it this way.
Why do we say Nazism is evil? The Nazis didn't think they were evil. The Nazis thought that what they were doing was for the good of the race. And the truth is that humans are naturally given to the worship of strength and power. And we're naturally given to groupthink. We find it much easier to identify with people who are exactly like us than with people from vastly different cultures. I think people naturally, if you look at the course of history, people instinctively feel most comfortable with people who are like themselves. And the great foundational texts of Christianity are opposed to this. Paul says that there is no Jew or Greek, i.e., there is no black or white. There is no Englishman or Indian. They're all kind of essentially one. We're all created equally in the image of God. There is a set core equality. Now, that is something that the Nazis are radically opposed to. They say, no, absolutely there is Jew and Greek. Indeed, Hitler blames the Jews for the destruction of Greek and Roman culture. And the other thing that the Nazis, following in the footsteps of Nietzsche, are opposed to is the idea that there should be a strength in weakness. That those who are downtrodden should have a moral authority over those who are in power. And so, that again is what licenses the death not just of the Jews, but of people with physical or mental disabilities. But the Nazis do this convinced that Christianity has been a kind of gray breath that has destroyed everything that's most heroic and noble in the German. Hitler thinks that both the Greeks and the Romans are of Germanic stock, and that they were destroyed by Paul coming along with his cosmopolitan insistence that all humans are equal. And so this actually leads to what is perhaps the most grotesque paradox in the whole of Christian history, which is that one of the reasons that the Jews are targeted for genocide is because Hitler blames them for Christianity. And so when the Nazis deny the common brotherhood of man, and when they deny that those who are at the bottom of the pile have a kind of moral strength greater than that at the top of the pile, they are trampling on the fundamentals of Christianity. That explains why, in the modern West, Nazi is a term of horror in a way that, say, communism isn't, even though Stalin and Mao killed vastly more people than Hitler did. So, what we do in the West is to say, what would Hitler have done? And then we do the opposite. Now, this is still a kind of Christian way of thinking. We're shocked by the Nazis because the Nazis trampled on Christian assumptions. But there's a problem. I think that we are standing face to face now in the West, which is that the things that Christianity demands are quite difficult. It's quite difficult to love your enemies. It's quite difficult to be as welcoming to people who are outside your family, your clan, your nation, as to within. And what resources do people have in the West now to make this case? To say that the first will be last and the last will be first. As a secular progressive liberal, my sense of what is good is Christian. And so, I don't want to lose that because I think that those essentially are my values. So I want those values to be watered and sustained. I want the soil in which and from which they spring to continue to have nutrients. And I don't think at the moment, we don't have that.
Tom Holland is in essence saying that Hitler is so evil because he is the one person more than anyone else who rejects the Christian values that we have all shared for 2,000 years. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you will continue to join us as we talk about the Christian foundations of our deepest values.